Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Teach, Seat, Repeat. My name is Dylan.
And my name is Hayden.
Hayden, how's your week been?
My week has been superb.
Yeah?
What about you? It's been lovely and sunny, isn't it?
It's been lovely and sunny. It's been really nice. Yeah. My week's been great because just me, had a little chat with someone who's going to be on his podcast today. Where were you, Hayden?
I was on school residential, which is always good fun. And I guess let's chat about that next week. I'll reflect on it next time. Okay. But school residential, we'll have a chat.
No problem. But today's episode, as you've probably seen by the title, if you've clicked on this, is all about politics and politics in school. Because...
Oh, sorry. Just saw half our audience go.
Well, it's typical. It's topical at the minute.
It is.
Because as this episode has been released on a Monday, it's the general election in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in just 3 days.
I keep forgetting it's that close.
I know, literally.
Oh,
so if you're listening to this, it's probably just before the actual election. We're going to talk in general because I don't want to sit here and chat about how, you should vote for this person, or you should vote for that person. I think what's a more conducive chat for us as teachers, as people in education, and something that I think everyone's interested in, having seen lots of discussion online, especially recently having posted some stuff ourselves on our Instagram and, random people commenting like, oh, aren't you a teacher? You can't be saying this kind of stuff, can you? And it's just this idea of, I suppose, what is our role as teachers? What is the role of the school in teaching children about how our country is literally ran?
Wider life.
Exactly. And particularly politics because of the general election. If I look at what I do in school and what most people do, it's minimal, really. And it takes this kind of big event of a general election to even have it talked about in school. But it is literally how our country's run.
Yeah. I agree.
So what do you do in school?
I do nothing at all. Not even the curriculum. No, I'm joking. No, nothing. I'm afraid to mention it, to be honest with you. I'm afraid to talk politics. Okay. I will have a chat with some kids if they want to talk about it.
What makes you afraid?
Because if you... We'll talk about this afterwards, let's talk about after this conversation, we can talk about a bit about bias, right? I'm afraid that my personal bias is going to come through, and then some Aggie parent is going to have something to say about that. Yeah. Because it's not on the national curriculum to talk about it, and maybe that's another discussion we can have, should it be?
It's not right, is it, to kind of bring your personal opinion in that respect into the classroom?
I guess we've had a chat about that sort of thing before, but no, I don't think it's right, because at the end of the day, if someone had the complete opposite opinion to me, something that I didn't like, part of me would be like, oh, don't say that to the kids.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So let's talk about that afterwards in more depth, because, Hayden, whilst you're swanning away on a residential, having a time of your life, I'm sure, proper holiday, isn't it, for a teacher, a residential? I actually heard back from someone I wanted to talk to. So Alastair Campbell is actually coming on the podcast, which seems insane to me, because anyone who doesn't know who Alastair Campbell is, I mean, I'm sure you do, one of the most prominent people under the Blair government.
Well, I will just say, jumping in quickly, obviously I knew you messaged me when I was on residential saying, oh, guess who's coming on the podcast when you happen to not be here.
I very specifically said to him, it has to be this day.
Yeah, I know, couldn't believe it, but I was, very excited for you. But I said to the staff that I was with, oh, Alastair Campbell's coming on, and they all knew. They're like, oh, from the Blair government. And I was like, he's coming on, he's talking to Dylan.
Well, we've spoken a lot, haven't we, previously, how it just felt like, having gone to school during the years of New Labour, that we had stuff in school, and then having taught afterwards. Anyway, we talk about it. Well, me and Alastair, my new podcast host.
Your new co-host.
Yeah, we talk about it on our podcast. But, anyone who doesn't know, Alastair Campbell, he runs with Rory Stewart the biggest podcast in this country called The Rest is Politics. It's a political one. He's obviously from the Labour side. Rory's from the Conservative side. And, I'm not going to sit here and say, go and listen to their podcast, like our endorsement's going to help them out at all. But if you are remotely interested in politics, it's an amazing podcast.
It's one of your top. It's probably your favourite, isn't it?
I listen to it most days. Yeah, I listen to a few political podcasts. But Alastair very, very kindly agreed to come on, and there is a reason. It's because he has released 2 new books, and they are directly aimed at children. And the aim of these books, and I've read both of them, is to get children engaged in politics. Now, if you think of Alastair Campbell, I think straight away of Labour. Very staunch Labour man, wants Labour to get into power, doesn't like the Conservatives very much. So I thought, what better person to chat to about what's the role of schools then? Because, if he was to walk into a school, a primary school, say, would he be saying to children, you should vote Labour because the Tories, oh, bloody hell. And having read his books, and we'll talk about it in a second, he seemed to be able to avoid that. And it's really interesting. So I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the role of school. We talk about education in general. Hayden, you've actually listened to the chat.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is we'll play it for you guys now. And then afterwards, you and I were going to sit down, reflect on it, and then chat about what we think, is appropriate in school or not.
Yeah, brilliant. I thought it was great. Let's get to the chat.
Let's do it. Hi, Alastair. Thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
So we're here today to talk about the fact you're releasing 2 brand new books. What is Politics, aimed at primary school children, and Alastair Campbell Talks Politics, which is aimed much more at the teenage kind of audience. And I suppose the problem we have at the minute in politics and with children, and I guess with adults in general, is that apathy is just at an all-time high. No one seems to care about politics or want to know anything about it. They're just so disillusioned. So I suppose my first question to you is, how can we actually address this? You know, what is the point of your books? Why have you written them? How can we make children and adults, I suppose, a lot more interested in politics as a whole?
Well, they're aimed very, very directly and specifically at children rather than at teachers. But obviously, teachers are likely to be teachers and parents. I'm assuming are going to be the vehicle to get children, hopefully, to take an interest and to read them. And the aim. I mean, I'll tell you how it happened. I wrote a book last year or year before called "But What Can I Do? Where Politics has Gone Wrong, and What You Can Do to Help Fix It." And that was aimed very much at adults. And then I got approached by another publisher who said, "I've read your book, really liked it, but I think your real audience for this should be children." And I thought about it, so yeah, that's actually a very, very good point. I do a lot of talks in schools anyway. So the first one for primary schools, and thank you for reading them, and thank you for having me to talk about them as well. But the first one for primary schools, as you've seen, is trying to explain in really simple language what politics is, how it works, what happens in it, what the king does, what Parliament is, what the House of Lords does, all sort of very, very simple questions. But also then try to explain why it matters, and most importantly, from my perspective, kind of, you know, how you get interested, and how you get engaged, and how you get involved. And then the one for teenagers is much, you know, it's longer, it's got more questions in it, it's maybe more detailed, but it's also about how do you debate, how do you make a decision, how do you strategize, and so forth. So I actually think the older kids book, I think will get quite a lot of adult readers, because I think it's, you know, for a lot of adults, there's stuff in there that they don't necessarily know, because unless you do politics A level, you don't learn much about politics in school.
No, almost nothing, honestly. And I was going to say, having read both, so I've read both, the one for primary school, the one that you've aimed more towards teenagers. I think they're both very similar. You're absolutely right in terms of they're quite factual, they're quite to the point, and I having listened to your podcasts and knowing your background, especially politically, you left a lot of that out, and that opinion of, you know, well, I think this is the way we should do things. And even the part about the Lords in the primary school one, it was really interesting for me to read, because you made it sound like the Lords was a fantastic thing. Like it was a really good idea.
Oh well, I've made a mistake there.
And I thought that straight away. I thought, I know what he thinks. But this is something I was going to try and just pry into you a little bit. Because as a teacher who's really interested in politics, and even as a teacher who isn't, if we're going to address this with children and get them involved in the facts, there is a fine line between what we can teach in school and what's appropriate for at home. And I'm wondering where you think that line is, because as teachers, you know, we can't sit there and give our opinions straight up to the kids as facts. And, you know, well, obviously it's wrong that schools are underfunded because of this and that. You know, that's a political choice. So I'm wondering where you kind of fall on that. Having read your book, it feels like you just want people to know more about it, like the actual functions.
Well, that's definitely the purpose of this book. I mean, you know, I think that, and it is, listen, it's difficult for teachers because everybody has political opinions, even if they're not aware of them, and everybody has views about big decisions in government and so forth. But when I was writing both of the books, I want them to be entertaining. I want to hope that they'll hold kids' attention. But at the same time, at the back of my mind was, what if I've got some kind of, you know, redneck parent who probably doesn't like me anyway, and let's say a teacher gives my book to a kid and says, "Oh, I think you should read this. I think you'd enjoy it." And they go home, and the dad or the mum picks it and says, "What's this? I don't like him. Let me see what he's saying."
Yeah.
I was very conscious. I didn't want them to be able to say there's anything there that's sort of pushing them one way or the other. So, for example, when I talk about the role of the king, so the king is head of government, head of state, the king is head of state, head of the church, head of the military. They have a very important role in our constitution. And I make the point, because as you also know, listening to the podcast, I'm not the biggest monarchist in the world. So I make the point that, you know, I'm not the biggest monarchist in the world, but I'm very much in the minority.
Yeah.
For most people, this is a part of the system actually they approve of. They might not have, but, you know, let's be honest, King Charles is much more popular than most politicians.
Yeah, particularly.
So I've buried my own views. I think I say in the one that, you're very hard pressed to find somebody today who says that Brexit is going really, really well. Well, that, yes, is my opinion, but I struggle to find people these days who think Brexit is going well. So I try and stay that side of the line. I don't say vote Labour. I don't say that, I do say that I think Boris Johnson was a disaster and Liz Truss was a disaster, but, I think that's fair comment. And even the kind of, the redneck dad, I think is probably going to, well, he's got a point there.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to disagree with that one. I suppose that's where that line is blurred a little bit, isn't it? Because like you said, it is undeniable schools have been squeezed in terms of the funding. It's undeniable that mortgage rates went through the roof directly because of what these politicians have done. So when, as a teacher, I struggle with that in terms of what's appropriate even to bring up, because I'll give you one story quickly. There's one children especially, I teach year 4 children, they're 7, 8 years old. So, they have a very, I don't know how to put it, shallow view of the world in terms of politics and what's going on. And a lot of the time I find they're simply parroting what their parents have said at home. And I had one child, and one of the only kind of times that politics has literally come up, because they don't know about it, we don't teach it, was one child sat there and basically just said how amazing Boris Johnson was. Oh, isn't he a brilliant prime minister? He's saying what people want to hear, he's doing what people want to do. And as a teacher who, my personal opinion, very much anti that, and I think he's an abomination, I had to really step back and just go, okay, interesting, other people might disagree, but that's your opinion, and pride of it just turned out it's what his dad had said, basically.
Yeah, for sure. But there's a bit you mentioned there about could you say all education is underfunded? What I've done on that, for example, is in some of the challenges that I give the kids, I say, right, okay, go away and check online, how much it costs to run the health service, how much it costs to run British schools and so forth. Let's imagine you're the Prime Minister and you want to spend 10 billion more on schools or on hospitals. What would you spend less on?
Yeah.
So I don't say all schools are underfunded, they should get more.
Yeah.
I say, if you're the Prime Minister, you're actually having to make difficult decisions, trying to get the kids to understand that's what government is like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And when I do go into schools, obviously you get some kids who just think, who's this old bloke coming in here, I don't care what he thinks. But I find actually most kids are really, really interested. Once you explain to them, from my perspective, where I've come from, what my background is, the work that I've done in media and then in politics and the stuff that I do now, when I talk about some of the characters that I know, some of the big issues I've dealt with, it's very rare I don't get a classroom that thinks, oh, that's quite interesting. And then you start to bring them out of themselves and they become really quite enlivened and excited about what politics might mean to them. And I did a school recently where I'd say about a third of the class were going to get the vote for the first time,
right,
in the general election on July the 4th. And honestly, there was a real excitement that I felt I could tap into by. And again, even in school, I mean, I never hide the fact what my politics are, but I do say to them, I'd rather you voted Tory than didn't vote at all.
Yeah.
But what I'd really like you to do is to think about it. What is you're not choosing between, or is it 9 out of 10 perfection or 10 out of 10 perfection? You're choosing between political parties and political candidates, and you have to make a judgment in the round about who you think will be the best person.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. But take it seriously. Find out genuinely who they are and what they're saying.
That's the thing. This is what I was going to ask you about again, because I think without a doubt, every single person in this landscape of political, commentary, through your podcast, Rest is Politics with Roy Stewart, through, I've been listening to Times Radio. I'm not a reader of the Times, but I'm just trying to take in as much as I can. And everyone down to a T says, register to vote, go and vote. And I wanted just to push you a bit again, as someone who's quite opinionated, and I, very much, I'd say you'd say yourself, anti-conservative. You've kind of touched on it there a bit. Would you genuinely rather convince someone, and would you spend a good chunk of time convincing someone to vote, knowing they're going to vote against what you believe in? Do you find that is much better?
Or put it this way, right now, during an election period, if I was trying to persuade someone to do anything, I'd be trying to persuade them to vote Labour.
Yeah.
Or vote to get rid of a Tory if it's in a kind of Lib Dem margin or something.
Yeah.
But in general terms, I will absolutely say to people, in fact, it happened the other day, I was in Germany for the football, and I met these young guys, and they were English. We'd been at a Spain-Croatia game, and they were giving me a bit of grief. We were having a bit of a laugh. They were sort of, taking the mick more of you. And one of them was telling me his hero is Marine Le Pen, and, whatever. And anyway, so then we go. And then one of them said, I don't think I'll bother voting. And I said, I really think you should. And I say to people like that, look, I'd obviously like to persuade you to vote Labour, but if you actually thought, do you know what? I believe what Rishi Sunak's saying. I think he's better than Keir Starmer. I'd rather you said that, but thought about it first.
Yes.
And then voted. And I genuinely mean that. I think that, look, I'd be in favour of compulsory voting. And I think actually compulsory voting allied to political education and lowering the voting age,
right,
I think would be a real boost to the kind of the health of democracy. Because the problem at the moment, and this maybe relates more to the senior school book, is that, a lot of older people have this view of younger people. Either, this is kind of my view, quite romantic, quite rosy. I think that's where the energy is coming from. That's where the future is going to be shaped. And, if you spend a bit of time with any young person, you're going to find a lot of good in there. That's kind of my view. Another view is they're all very spoiled. They're all entitled. They all think, they spend the whole time on social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's somewhere in between.
Yeah, sure.
But the bit that I think people should be aware of is that the decile of the population in every continent of the world that is most attracted to authoritarianism is the young. It's not the old. That being said, a far bigger majority is not attracted to authoritarianism, actually does care about future of the planet, inequality, gay rights, trans rights, all the kind of, all the public services, all the stuff that kind of motivates people. And I just think it's important that they are educated, including in school.
Yeah.
They're educated about the importance of them having a voice, them respecting their own views and feeling that their views matter. And this thing about, us all sort of just absorbing the views of our parents, I mean, look, that's fine up to a point. But on something as important as politics, if you're only getting your views from, say, one newspaper or one parent, whatever it might be, it's never going to give you a broad enough canvas. And I feel that, one of the things I've tried to do with both of the books is get kids to almost kind of want to learn about politics and say to their teachers, why aren't we talking?
Absolutely.
Why don't we talk about politics?
Yeah, it's really important. I was going to kind of lead on from what you said there in terms of the overall desire for you, I guess, having read them books myself, is I got that you just wanted children to literally get involved in politics and understand what it is. Yeah. And I look at it today, and I'm an avid listener of your podcast, and it seems to me as if we could go back through every single prime minister in a row, and the overwhelming feeling would be negativity, and would be, like you said, King Charles is more popular than any MP you can think of, and we've got the betting scandal at the minute, and we've got all this kind of idea that politics is just an absolute cesspit. And I suppose what I'm saying is what you're doing is really valuable, getting it into schools. But for those children who then do kind of have their interest piqued by, lessons in school and teachers and books like yours, who have they actually got to look up to then in the world of politics at the minute? Because I look at it and I think it's sparse. I know you mentioned in your, I think it was your Alastair Campbell Talks Politics book, you mentioned the fact you were inspired by MLK and, this amazing figure and this unbelievable speech about him having a dream. If I look at politics in the last 10, 15 years in my adulthood, so I turned 18 in 2010, just in time for this coalition, which was great timing. But if I look at my adult life, I can't see anyone or think of anything tangible that I can hold on to and say, wow, politics did that. That's made my life so much better. And I kind of understand it when people are more apathetic. What can we do about that?
Well, I was in a school recently, and this girl, she was about 14. And she said this question. It made me really sad when she said it, but her friends kind of laughed because she was, it was like she was taking the mickey out of me, really. But she wasn't. I spoke to her afterwards. She was really serious. And she said, has politics always been as bad as this?
Yeah.
And wow. And I said, well, why did you say that? And her only memories of politics, real memories, she said, were family rows about Brexit, Johnson being Prime Minister, COVID parties, Truss, Putin, Trump, Gaza.
Wow.
That was it. And she knew a bit about climate, and she cared about climate and biodiversity.
Yeah.
And she said she felt that was going backwards. So, if that's your experience of politics, so I was able to, it's why I say in the book, things like Martin Luther King, things like when we did the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah.
When I launched the book, I did it on this thing with Waterstones. I had 2,500 school kids on there. And there were quite a lot from Northern Ireland. And I was thinking, there's a kid there, he's 12 or 13. He has grown up in a Northern Ireland that his parents didn't know.
Yeah, amazing.
And politics did that.
Yeah.
Politics did it. So it's trying to persuade people that it's not a cesspit. And even now at the moment, obviously on one level, I can look at the betting scandal and think, oh, this is quite good because it's doing the Tories even more damage. On the other hand, I think, God almighty, it's all we've heard about for 4 days and we're in the middle of an election campaign.
Yeah.
Can we please talk about the economy? Can we please talk about education? Can we please talk about transport or something?
Yeah, literally.
And I think that the other reason why I think, one of my mottos is read books, not newspapers. I think that books like this, I hope, will, and it's what you said. I mean, I do want to inspire young people to think, I'm going to give that a go.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and I think having read them, especially the primary one with my primary head on, it's a book I can imagine diving into with my kids. And I think the thing that I'm really passionate about and what your book would be a vessel for, in my opinion, is just getting kids to talk about it, and literally just to get them to understand that politics isn't this thing where blokes in suits just go into a weird old room and shout at each other. Politics is the fact that this morning you went to Breakfast Club for free. You might not know that, but it's affecting your life. And I suppose what I wanted to make the point of again was, like I said, I was born in 1993. So my childhood through school, my experience was under a Labour government, under New Labour. And I know, having been interested in politics, education. I'm sure everyone said that to you a million times. Yeah. But I felt like I went to school and I had things, and it sounds so crazy that I can just dilute it into that. But I had stuff. It felt like there was funding because we had new playtime equipment. It felt like every year we got a new computer suite. It felt like we always had something where our teachers weren't burnt out and worried about their paycheck and stuff. And now I work in school, and I can compare it directly. I know I might have rose-tinted glasses because I enjoyed school, but it's the comparison is just unbelievable.
I know. Listen, I see it everywhere I go. And the other thing, I'll give you another thing which sometimes connects and resonates with children, particularly boys. And you take something like virtually every senior school you go into these days, Andrew Tate's name comes up.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, that's horrific.
Yeah.
But that's political.
Yeah.
That's political. He is part of a kind of political positioning. And he's using political tools such as social media, such as TikTok, all that other stuff. He's using that to have political influence over young people.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we say, oh, well, you can't possibly have a teacher telling what's right and wrong and what's politically good and politically bad. But you can allow this kind of avalanche of misogynist bullshit to infect their minds.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's broadening that definition of and getting kids to understand that politics can either be a force for good or a force for bad.
Yeah.
And there's that quote I have in the book, from Pericles. You may not do politics, but politics is going to do you. That's true.
I remember an advert campaign. Again, I don't know when it was. I would have just been a literal child. Wouldn't know what politics was, but it stuck with me. And it was there were two blokes sat in a pub, and one of them started talking about politics, and the other one said, I don't do politics. And then it just cut to like 3 or 4 or 5 different situations in his life where he wanted to complain about the potholes in the road, and he wanted to complain about the price going up in the shops. And his mate would go, you don't do politics. You can't talk about it. And I suppose the whole point is, from a young age, not, as you said, broadening that definition, hopefully will actually make a difference in terms of people being interested in it.
For sure. And let's be honest, so many people these days are cynical. Kids are in the main being raised by parents who are cynical about politics.
Yep.
If you watched that Question Time last night,
I did.
There were some good questions, but for the BBC to have a guy asking a question, are you two the best people that this country can produce? It's just like playing into this idea. You're all shit. You're all the same.
It felt like GB News question. I know it sounds stupid because I know GB News are certain, right wing of anything, but it felt like a pandering to just get a clap. Do you know what I mean? You're like, you're all rubbish. And I really wanted to ask you this, Alastair, because I've listened to a lot of your podcasts. I know you host a podcast with Rory Stewart, an ex-Tory minister. So you couldn't be further apart on your spectrum of what you've done in government and things like that. And what do I say to my children, or even my colleagues? Let's say my apathetic colleagues or my children who are just learning, who again just say, "Oh, they're all the same. They're all the same, aren't they?" All these politicians, because I really believe they're not, and I want to know what you think.
Well, I'll tell you how I answer that question. I always say things like, particularly with young people, I'll say, "Okay, hands up who thinks Brexit was a good idea." Nobody will put their hand up. I'll say, so do you think it matters that we've left the European Union? Yeah, of course. And I say, well, the reason we left the European Union was because politicians, people like Nigel Farage, led the campaign with newspapers to try and force David Cameron to have a referendum. David Cameron had the referendum. David Cameron thought he was going to win the referendum. Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, for their own reasons, not very noble in my view, decided to fight for leave, not remain. That is what made the difference.
Yeah.
They made the difference. I may hate the fact that they've become they actually have got historical figures for that reason.
Yeah.
And then I say to them, if Hillary Clinton had beaten Donald Trump, do you think America and the world would be exactly the same or different? The world would be different. Right. Well, that's because she's different to him.
Precisely.
Right.
Yeah.
Jeremy Corbyn, Boris Johnson, different.
Yeah.
Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, different. People want to say they're all the same. They're incredibly different. John Major, Tony Blair beat John Major. Now, give you an example. And I've actually got a lot of time for John Major these days. I think, age has mellowed me. And I
listened to his leading interview of you guys.
Yeah,
really good.
Great. Yeah, really good. But the fact is that we were fighting in that election campaign in 1997 for a minimum wage. The John Major attack on that policy was it will cost 1 million jobs. It didn't. It didn't. It helped the employment market. And that change, by the way, I think I say in the Talks Politics book, that change took 100 years for the Labour Party to get.
Wow.
The first campaign for a minimum wage was 100 years before it happened.
That's insane. That's crazy. And I guess what I'm looking at these days, moving towards, I suppose, the election that's literally happening now in terms of education. I've had colleagues say to me, they're all the same. And I'm really trying to convince them that they're not, though. So if we can vote for change, we really should, and trying to get across that. But I suppose what I was going to say to you is I find myself sometimes saying that from a very much anti-Tory point of view. Now, I know you've interviewed Bridget Phillipson. You're very much pro-Labour, just like I am as well, in terms of we want a Labour government. But I will be really honest. If I was an apathetic teacher watching that debate yesterday, or in fact any debate, or in fact any coverage at all of this election, I would not be, I would forgive them for thinking, well, what are they going to do for education then? If I'm thinking as a teacher sat there, okay, I know they're going to put VAT on private schools. Okay, cool. That's a really tangible thing. I can see they're going to, hire teachers because of it. But, there was a survey where the top 10 things teachers are currently worried about or want change with, none of them involved private school taxing. It was, retention figures are horrendous. Support staff aren't given enough money, or we don't have enough support staff. Class sizes are bigger. What's your opinion on when July 5th comes around, assuming we're going to get a Labour government? I know you don't want to say we will, but assuming we will, what's your opinion of what will happen? Do you think we will see quick change, or will it take a bit of time?
I think it'll take time. I think there will be stuff that hopefully will happen fairly quickly, because the thing about the old cliche, change begets change. I think if there is change, there will be a change of mood in the country.
Yeah,
there will be a new sort of energy, and people will start to think of kind of more innovative ways of doing stuff. But the money is going to be tight. There's no doubt about that. I don't know if you saw the interview we did with Bridget Phillipson on the podcast last week.
Yeah,
and I thought it was I was kind of saying to myself, would I rather have her in charge of our schools than Gillian Keegan? All day. Is she going to struggle to meet all the demands and expectations of everybody in the sector, for sure.
Definitely.
Because anybody would in the current environment.
Well, even David Blunkett said he was met with, derisory cheers and people against him, and he did a lot of good for the education.
Exactly. So it's going to be hard, but I think the Blunkett point is interesting. The thing for me on education that I don't fully understand is that it has fallen down the political agenda. Now, you can blame the government for that, but actually what is up and down the political agenda isn't just about the government. It's about campaigning.
Yeah.
It's about the opposition. It's about whether, in your world, whether the trade unions can actually sort of, elevate the issues up the agenda. It's about the media. It's about whether the media care about stuff. Now, we took a strategic decision. You said education. That was the classic example of a soundbite that actually was underlining a strategy.
Yeah.
It was basically saying, and I'll give you an example that where Labour are doing it at the moment. Labour have been emphasising the importance of planning reform.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's important, and hopefully they'll be able to do it. It's only if you do emphasise in opposition that you can actually do stuff in government. So education, standards, not structures. The pledge on the smaller class size is paid for by getting rid of the assisted places schemes. These were signals of direction.
Yeah.
What I would say about what Labour are doing at the moment, so the VAT thing, for example, is a signal of direction.
Yeah.
That when it comes to priorities, we are going to put the state sector right up there.
Definitely.
Okay. So that's a relatively small change, which is causing a lot of grief in kind of, some parts of the country with some parts of the population who don't like it, call it class war and all that stuff. But what it's doing is signalling that's our priority. Then in relation to, I thought it was interesting that Bridget talked on the podcast about, the current curriculum is essentially Michael Govian.
I wanted to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's going to change. And that, again, I think will hopefully create a kind of a new sense of energy. But where you're absolutely right is that ultimately Labour are going to have to be able to grow the economy and are going to have to invest more. I think the other thing that will happen, though, is that, I can remember, for example, we did all sorts of stuff. People go on about this, partnership with the private sector and what have you. We did loads of stuff in partnership with the private sector about improving certain aspects of the education system at different points. And I hope there'll be more of that as well.
Yeah, I hope so. I get that impression that they're talking about it. I know why they're doing it. They don't want to overpromise and they want to get into power. And I think what I would say is, as teachers, when I know my colleagues and I talk to people about politics, what I will say, pros or cons out of the window for a second. In 2017, there was a huge kind of uplift. I had colleagues who were excited about things might change. And Corbyn was in charge and he had all of these policies, but ultimately he didn't get into power. And ultimately there were a million other reasons why that didn't happen and he got down. So I've kind of changed over that time. And I think power is more important than policies in terms of when you're out of it. You need to be in power first, then you can actually, get change on the table.
100%. It's like, I was speaking at an event this morning. It was a business thing, but, they were saying this pretty room full of quite wealthy people, and one of them said, I'd be happy to pay more tax and for better public services. I said, well, that's fine, you can say that, but I'm just telling you that Keir Starmer is, if he becomes Prime Minister, will become only the fourth Prime Labour leader ever to have gone from opposition to government.
That's just insane, isn't it, when you think about it? Yeah.
Let me tell you something else. I put this in the book. 21 old Etonian prime ministers in our history. 7 Labour, he'll be the 7th Labour, only 4 that have gone direct from opposition to government. Now, many of those who have tried and failed, they were going to put your taxes up.
Well, yeah, and I suppose the other problem, I guess, again, lots of people listening to this, that they remember Keir Starmer, in 2019 or 2020 when he came in, had a big job to change the party, but he made a lot of promises. He said a lot of things because he needed to get voted as the leader of the party. And to do that, you've got to flirt much more with the left of the party, which we know because the membership are much further on the left. But so in terms of trying to increase integrity and be against lying, and when I talk to my children, sometimes I feel like it's an insult to say that MPs are like children on the playground, because you know what? Children on the playground are better behaved half the time. But when I talk to my kids about the importance of telling the truth and being transparent, It's really hard because even when I look at my politics, I'm sympathetic with Starmer. I'm going to vote Labour. I want a Labour government, but I can see how people can legitimately say, "Well, do you know what? He said it was going to have this massive green policy, and he said that he was going to do this, and he supported Corbyn back then." So, where do you think that line is? When I'm talking to my kids, what can I say to them in terms of, lying's bad, but real life is more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think he would. What I think would want you to say is that he wasn't lying. He was making a set of proposals that at the time he felt were the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And because the economy has changed so much, and because the country has changed so much, and also because he does want to get elected, he's had to compromise. If you like, he's compromised with the electorate, which is part of what democracy is about. We've just interviewed Helle Thorning-Schmidt, the former Prime Minister of Denmark. She was making the point that because of their political system, they've never had a majority. It's always a compromise. It's always coalition. So you have to you do that. So I think that where I agree with you, if Labour get in and, for example, do put taxes up straight away or do increase borrowing straight away when they've said that they won't, that's going to be a big problem.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big problem.
Well, at least he's doing it before the election, is what I say to people who have the argument. And he's very much at this point trying to win votes, and is doing so on the back of being fiscally responsible and not over-promising. So I completely get it. Just a couple of things I wanted to ask you about, because you've mentioned lowering the voting age. Now, something I think it puts us in line. Again, you put in your book about in Wales and Scotland, you can be 16 in certain votes to put your name forward. I am for this policy. I agree with it because I think it has to come in tandem, though, with education and people being taught about it, because almost similar to what you said about compulsory voting. Well, what's the point unless we're actually going to teach people what it's about? But I'm just going to put it to you. I want to know what you think, because I've had people say it to me and I don't know what to say in terms of, I don't feel like I've got a leg to stand on, because this lowering of the voting age is going to massively favour a Labour government in the future in terms of the younger voters tend to be more left. They might be Green, they might be Lib Dem.
You say that, but at the moment, issues like the environment, issues like Gaza, I don't think you can take it for granted. It's like, a decade ago, certainly when we first came into power in 1997, and through quite a long time thereafter, you would have, if we'd have sort of made some changes to favour Scottish people, people would have said, "Oh, you're doing that because Scotland always votes Labour," right? Yeah. Then suddenly they didn't. And
it's very true.
You can't assume that young people are always going to be Labour. No. And the other thing I know, it's like, for example, you could argue that I used to feel sometimes like, some of the stuff that we did, for example, on gay rights, and I used to get really pissed off if I met somebody who was gay and then said to me, I'm a Tory, and which was unreasonable, because I was basically thinking, because we did something for the gay community, you should sort of, thanks for that. But that's not how life works. No. And it's the same with young people. Once the voting age lowers and 16, 17-year-olds start to vote, the reason I support it is because I think it's a way of saying to people, you've got the responsibility now to think about it a bit more.
Yeah.
And I think that will happen. I think, let's be honest, if you lower the voting age in schools, surely the education system's got to adapt to that.
If children have to be in school until 18, there's an automatic 2-year crossover. There's no teacher. There's no way you would just like,
exactly.
It would be it would happen basically down the line, because a lot of teachers want to do it even earlier just to get a real life example.
Well, there is this. I don't approve of this, by the way, but there is a sort of school of thought that says you should lower the voting age to 5.
Wow.
And then what happens is that the discussion takes place in the family and so on. Now, I'm not sure I approve of that, but I certainly think that. I remember my daughter Grace when she was a teenager, she's probably about 14, and I used to say I'd definitely lower the voting age, and she said, "Dad, loads of my friends, they don't know anything about politics." And I said, yeah, but they might know more if they thought they had to take it a bit more seriously. And added to which, let's go for a walk now and let's meet some people aged 40, 50, 60, 70 and 80. Yeah. And let's see how much they know about politics.
That falls down completely. What I will say is, on the lowering the voting age, I think that one of the reasons why I'm so massively for it is because I was 17 in the 2010 election. So I'm looking at it, and that election, I don't know, I'm making this up, but statistics maybe can prove me right. It felt like it had the biggest single terrible impact on the livelihood of young people, because my tuition fees tripled. my standard of life. I think in general, if you look at house prices and, you know, everything that's happened with the economy since austerity measures, you know, doctors, everything like that, I look at it and I just think, I wish, and I know at the point I would have had something to say about it. And I basically we walked into that austerity measure and it just completely ruined it.
Absolutely. 100%.
100%. Well, what I wanted to do, I usually have a co-host, Hayden, with me, so it's just me. So our usual listeners are probably, you know, very grateful that he's not here, to be honest with you. But he did have one question that he wanted me to ask you, because he's the classic apathetic, but he's going to vote Labour because he hates what's gone on. He wants change, but he's not very political at all. He had a very simple question. If you were in government again, for this Labour government right now, or any government whatsoever, and you came into power on July the 5th, what would you want to be doing first? Your first three things, and it can be to do with education or it can be in general. What would you be advising the Prime Minister? Right, let's fix this. Alastair Campbell wants to do this.
Well, I don't know if it'd be the first. If you're giving me three,
yep.
I really do think we've got to repair the damage that Brexit's done.
Mm-hmm.
So I would want him to work on a much, much closer relationship with the European Union. I'd want him to take on the populism that is going to follow a Tory defeat. I think in relation to education, I'd actually want to see a very clear signal that education was going to be right up the priority list.
Yeah.
In a way that I don't think we've really seen that in opposition. And then I think you do have to, in election, you do have to focus on the things that the public have, that, you know, they're sending the message. The message they're sending is they want the economy fixed and they want the NHS fixed.
Yeah.
But I'd like to see if so. That's kind of what I think I'd say. If I could say a few other things that maybe I'd really like to see sport given a much greater place.
Absolutely.
I would like to see. I would like to see, alongside lowering the voting age, compulsory voting. I see that they're backing compulsory voter registration, which is a good thing, but I'd like to see them go further than that.
Yep.
And then the other thing I'd like to see greater devolution, greater powers for local authorities, and greater powers for more elected mayors. I'd like to see that. I think the one thing of our political system, the modern development, I think has really been good, has been elected mayors.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'd like to see that as well.
Yeah, no, excellent, brilliant. Well, you know what, Alastair, I'm not going to keep you any longer. I really appreciate your time. And
not at all, my pleasure.
What I will say is very quickly, you know, if you were in school, just read the books. They're really, really good. And they're just a nice stepping stone, I think. An opinion-free introduction to politics, which I think is exactly what every primary school and secondary school needs for their children. Right, Hayden. So that was the chat. What did you think?
Really, really enjoyable. I actually listened through it twice in the end because I was really interested the first time. And the second time, I wanted to go back and write down a few notes. But firstly, I just want to say a massive thank you to Alastair for coming on. I really, really appreciate it. I wasn't even there, but I really, really appreciate his time.
He was really nice, really approachable. Was a lovely guy. So
I could tell. First thing I want to bring up, right, and this isn't particularly in order of the podcast. It's just things that come into my mind.
Sure.
So he made me just rethink some of the things I think.
Really?
Now, in a previous episode, do you remember when we were talking about Jeremy Corbyn and I got a bit heated, saying, I was like, hey, Jeremy Corbyn, I'm going to take some of that back, right? Because one of the things I said was, I think Jeremy Corbyn is the only nice politician, the only genuine politician. Right. And I remember even after the episode, you were like, do you really mean that? And I was like, not really. I just got a bit heated in that moment. But Alice you actually, I think, challenged him about how a lot of people, and I think you were kind of thinking of me when you said this.
I'll be honest, I was thinking exactly of you.
A lot of other colleagues will say, all politicians are the same. And I will say that sort of thing. But I'm probably going to stop saying that because I really liked his point about, well, if Hillary Clinton got in America, would America be the same? Well, obviously not. It'd be really different because they're different politicians. And I think it's a really, really good point to make. So I want to start by saying definitely challenge my opinions a little bit and how I think about stuff, and made me just rethink a little bit about how I think about politics. As someone who's not as into it as you, but on the fringe of I'm still interested a bit.
I think it's really understandable how someone who hasn't really got an interest in politics, you can not have an interest in things, but understand a bit more. And I think that's the vibe of this whole thing. And I think a lot of adults, by the way, he mentioned this, would honestly benefit from reading his book for teenagers. It's so digestible and it's full of facts. And this is literally how it works. And this is who is involved. This is how you voted in. And I think a little bit more knowledge might hopefully quash some conspiracies and stuff. They're all in it together. They're all just one big blob. And it's honestly, just look at the Conservatives, right, who are in charge at the minute. There's about 7 different types of people. You've got your Borises, your old Etonites, but like he hosts a podcast with Rory Stewart, who also worked in the Conservative government. And if you sit and listen to him, it's honestly, as someone who's my whole life been so anti-Tory, I really like Rory Stewart, who's a Conservative. So maybe, if I'm an adult with these presuppositions about what people are like just because of the colour they wear in their rosette, what are kids going to think? Especially if they're just parroting what their parents say.
You read those books, didn't you? And because obviously he was talking about how he tried not to be biased in them, right? He was trying to present a fair representation of just being interested in politics rather than this is what I think kids get into what I believe what I say and
propaganda or something.
And I get that and I respect that. And I think if you were ever going to write a book about politics that was going to be taken seriously
for children,
I mean, it has to be that. And I think the more neutral, the better in terms of it actually being accepted.
So why do you think that is the case then for children? Because I think both our instincts immediately are like, yeah, of course it has to be. But that's without me even thinking about it for 2 seconds. So if we were to flesh this out a bit and think about in school, right? So let's say we're reading this book in school.
Yeah.
And you spoke about it earlier. You're a bit afraid almost of putting your personal opinion across.
Yeah, definitely.
Why is it so important then? Because what you would tell, right? You would tell the children in your class, I run a business. It's great to run a business. I think everyone should think about running a business.
Yeah.
Wow. And you're really selling the fact that you personally own a business.
Yeah.
Someone else doesn't, has a perfectly fine life. But, why would you think it's okay then to be like, you should run a business. Why don't you all be entrepreneurs? Someone else might be saying, no, you should do service. You should go into something like nursing or something. Why is that different then with politics?
I think that analogy is dipping into the world of capitalism.
Sure.
And the systems of capitalism and how we can encourage. We all want people to buy our things because that's a capitalist model. We all sell stuff, and whoever sells the most is winning at capitalism, right? But democracy is just a different thing to me.
Right.
I think what's the point of politics? To me, it's about obviously. Okay, there's 2 sides to this, right? When I'm teaching someone about politics, it's about teaching them to think for themselves. And Alastair mentioned that a lot. He just wants people to think and come to proper conclusions.
And come to his conclusions and my conclusions.
But his point, and he probably does deep down. Like we all want people to think like we think.
Yeah, of course you do.
But he made a wider point of that getting people into politics is about getting them to think about decisions that they can make that might affect the country, right?
Yeah.
And that to me is what democracy is. So when it comes to kids who are extremely impressionable, I don't want them to blindly follow other people's opinions. And you can't say that without including yourself in that.
Yeah, of course.
I don't want them to blindly follow my opinions. Obviously, I want them to come to the same sort of opinions that I've got on a completely separate note. Right. But when I'm teaching them about politics and the importance of democracy, I want them to be logical thinkers. I want them to be reasoned thinkers. I want them to think for themselves. So therefore, if there's going to be a book in school, I think it has to be that. Yeah. And it can't be, here's my political opinion. That's got a separate place, But if we're teaching kids about politics, it's got to be the first one. Right?
I remember back in when I first started teaching, so in my training year, so this would have been 15, 16 was my training year, and it was towards the end of the year. So it was in 2016, right? And I remember it was during the Euros. So we're in Euro 2024 now. So this is 8 years ago, Euro 2016. I had one of my last observations. I was in year 6, in my year 6 placement, and it was in a PSHE lesson. And I remember thinking, wow, okay, I could do one or two things here. I suppose I could just go off the script and do the next PSHE lesson on the really boring kind of, the plan that we've got. And it's just, it's going to be a bit naff, basically. Or because it's PSHE, as a teacher, I got a bit more license to kind of go away and do something I think is important to the kids. And even back then in 2016, and maybe this was to do with the Brexit referendum around that time as well, I wanted to really teach the kids something they have never been taught before.
Right.
And I did a lesson on the difference between rules and laws. And the idea was, touching upon Parliament and actually learning what a law is, and why in school we have rules like, don't talk to your partner. But that's breaking rules, and having rules are very different to laws. What makes them different, and why a law is enshrined in the legal service. And it kind of turned into a lesson all about Parliament. And I taught the kids about Parliament. Yeah. And I remember I had that teacher buzz. And I think this is the point I wanted to make about people are like, politics is naff. Fair enough. I'm interested in politics.
Yeah.
So I had this teacher buzz of I'm not going in there thinking, right, this is my politics. I'm going to indoctrinate these kids, which a lot of people seem to think for some reason is going on in school. I'll tell you now, we've barely got time to teach the curriculum. Don't worry, we're not indoctrinating children. That's not happening for a start.
No one is.
I think there's some people who are, and I think it's a problem. I think it's a huge problem. I don't think you should do that.
Yeah.
I really don't. Maybe we can talk about that in a second. But with my law and rules lesson, I really stripped it back. I was a brand new NQT, and I almost didn't have that fear. And I just thought, no, I'm going to teach them about... there are 650 MPs in the country.
Yeah.
How many people you walk down the street do you think know that?
Yeah, not many.
Not many.
Not
and
many
like just knowing the makeup of how who decides who the prime minister is. Well, we don't actually vote for a prime minister. You vote for someone to represent your area. Yeah. And then if they're part of a party, they can be in charge, and then their leader becomes prime minister.
Sure.
So this whole idea, this intricacy of how it works, I think it's really important to teach kids that. And I would never ever be against teaching them the literal cogs of our constitution, which is unwritten. We don't have a written one like America, but the way it works and the way our lives are literally affected massively. The only way we're going to get rid of apathy is from the ground up, really, in our future, knowing about what it is they are actually voting on.
So a couple of things then. So you and Alastair talked about the whole idea of lowering the voting age, to 16. And then you talked about the crossover. The fact that kids will still be in school, it kind of puts this pressure on the government to maybe include something in the national curriculum about politics, because there's this big crossover now. So my first question to you, and I think I already know this, but it will lead on to another one. Do you think politics should be taught in school?
Yes, and when we say politics, we need to be very clear. We mean the institutions and how they work. Yeah, the system. I think it is insane to me that you would leave school, be able to vote in the summer if there was an election, and there just isn't at least something that just tells you how it works.
Yeah.
At the very, very, very least. I know that we talked about this before about the school prepare for real life, and there's a lot of stuff you can argue should go in the curriculum, like we should learn how to pay taxes. But in the most intrinsic, basic level, we wouldn't have taxes if we didn't have a government.
Yeah, sure.
I just think that to me is one of the, I would want anyone walking down the street who is being able to vote to know what they're actually voting.
Or at least have had the opportunity at school to have picked up that knowledge. Because not everyone listens.
Can I give you an example of this?
Yeah.
So I was talking recently, I won't say who it was, I was talking to someone who is around my age, and they asked me really genuinely, and I know 5 years ago I might have laughed, but this time I just explained to them how it works. They'd heard someone say, if you don't vote, it's a vote for whoever's in power. Right, so there's this whole saying that if you don't go and vote, you're helping it means you're helping the majority.
Right.
So whoever's in front, if you don't vote, you're just helping them stay in power. Okay. Because if the idea is, let's say the Conservatives are in charge, you don't want them to be, but you don't really fancy any of the others, you just don't vote.
Yeah.
What people say is, if you don't vote, that's a vote for the Conservatives.
Okay.
Right, and the point is, you need to make your voice heard. If you really don't want them in charge, vote for
something else. Yeah.
They genuinely thought that if you didn't go to vote, they would cast a literal vote.
An automatic vote.
Yeah, they would cast a literal vote in your name for whoever's winning. And they'd get it added to their total. And it was a completely genuine sentiment because they heard,
I guess from that
if you don't vote, it's a vote for the other people.
They've extrapolated
and they don't know how it works. They don't know the actual system where, if you don't vote, it just doesn't count. And because of that, they've had this, what is just a generic statement that isn't a falsehood online. And they've literally thought that their vote would go to a party they didn't want. And the idea of that existing, obviously it's going to in small pockets, but this is an intelligent person who I was talking to who just was told this thing and thought, okay, that must be how it works, then I guess I'll vote. And it seemed insane to me to think, okay, there's got to be something we can do, whether you like politics or not. Do you know what? I'll be honest, guys, I'm gonna admit something right now, primary school teacher. I don't really like geography. I don't really like it that much. I don't actually find it that interesting to learn about rivers and deltas and things like that. But you know what? It's part of the curriculum. I'm a teacher. I teach kids what rivers are.
You'll deliver it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it more important that a child knows how their country literally works that they live in, or that a river might meander around a rock? There's an argument to say.
That's not for me and you to say.
No, there's an argument to say, though.
Yeah.
Not saying we should get rid of one, but there's an argument to say that it's quite important to know.
Well, it kind of, again, it goes back. I always go back to the episode, which is obviously a favourite of mine, where we talked about what should we teach in schools, and we talked about taxes and all that sort of stuff before, didn't we? We had that whole debate. I don't know. It's a tricky one. So I think, and maybe you can help me out with this thought train, right? I think there is a massive, massive risk that all we'll actually end up doing is just exposing our internal bias as teachers, as a general population, and just kind of saying what we want to say about particular parties and our own political ideas if we are opened up to the idea of teaching politics in school.
That's you know what, I completely understand that worry, and I think that's where, you know, we're not specialists, especially people who are apathetic, to then go and tell a teacher, actually you've got to teach politics now, it's got to be this really above board, extremely, you know, your opinion's taken out of it in every way possible. Number one, they might not know about it because they weren't taught about it, so they've got to teach themselves, and then number two, they can't then put their own spin on stuff, which I think is part of the job. I don't actually buy what you've just said in terms of there's a worry that teachers won't put their opinion across. I think it's part of our professional ability to do that. And the way the thing I always think about is RE. I am an atheist.
Yeah, okay? I was just thinking about
I am an atheist. I teach a lesson on Sikhism. I don't preface everything by going, by the way, kids, I don't believe in this. I don't believe in this. No, what? The creation story when I'm doing Christianity, 7 days, I think that's a load of baloney. I don't do that. When I'm teaching RE, what I do is I say, we're going to learn about Christians this week. Christians believe that blah, blah, blah.
Easy way to get around.
You know, we're learning about different cultures. If you're a Christian, you can tell me about what you believe.
What I'm saying is
nothing to do with me.
Goes deeper than this, though.
Right, okay.
What I'm saying is I wouldn't be able to guarantee that either you or I don't very, very subtly, passively, without even realizing it, subconsciously get our opinions across more strongly when teaching RE, for example, or if we were teaching politics. Sure. I think there is a risk that internal subconscious bias will come out whether we like to think we're doing it or not. That's kind of what I'm getting at, really. I don't think many teachers would outright would abuse that system to be like, hey, I'm going to make you all vote, you know, reform, or I'm going to make you all vote Tory or whatever. I mean, if anything, the way, you know, teachers are generally more left anyway, aren't they? So, you know, that there would immediately be, I imagine the Tories probably wouldn't like the idea of doing all this and having it in schools, because it would more likely, if there's going to be a bias, go towards the left.
Funny story. I mentioned in the chat with Alastair, I think, about the child who was parroting the fact Boris is an amazing leader. I had a message this week from someone on Instagram. By the way, you can follow us at Teach Sleep Repeat Podcast on Instagram.
Oh, nice.
And message us about anything. We'll get back to you. And someone messaged me this week in a flipped way. So I talked about how I had to bite my tongue because my personal opinion is Boris was dreadful.
Yeah.
But I'm in the classroom. It's wholly inappropriate at that moment for me to have an argument with an 8-year-old child about Boris being bad. Let him have it and crack on. It's nothing to do with what we're doing in the classroom. But I had a flip version from this person. It was really interesting. And this person had said, someone in year 2 had said, why is Rishi Sunak taking all our money? As if in a negative context. It's like, I don't like him because he's taking all our money away. And the teacher was telling me this story as if it was funny, because they agree with this child.
Yeah.
And again, equally in that moment, it would be very easy for a teacher to listen to that and go, I know, right? Isn't it awful?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
That might be what you just naturally do, and you laugh it off and you do it.
Because you do agree.
But is that the same as arguing with a child about Boris being bad?
Maybe, because you know what, I bet your reaction was probably to close that conversation quite quickly and move on from it, right? But let's just say in that moment, he said about another politician that you do like being good, you might have, without thinking about this whole scenario, you might have responded differently in a more biased way that affirms what they're saying.
Yeah, no, it's
I guess that's what I'm saying. I don't know if that's a huge risk or not. Like, is that just part of the parcel? You know, is it
dealing
better
with human
to have
beings?
a bit of? Is it better to have that? But also, people do just generally know about politics a bit more. Because I think, you know, we could draw a line, couldn't we? When we're talking about teaching them the systems, it could very easily be that it's strictly you teach them the systems. You don't even mention parties.
Sure.
You genuinely don't. You know, you don't.
Or you might say they exist.
Parties exist, and they fight for different things. But you don't go into what Labour do and what Conservatives do. You don't actually do it at all.
Yeah.
And you just say this is the system.
Yeah, appropriate in home or at school. And I suppose you're saying that's very much a home thing.
Yeah.
Is what
so I think the more we give, if it came out and said, in the national curriculum now, what we need to do is teach them about the top 5 parties at the time. That might change over time. I think it just opens a doorway for teachers to be scrutinised and probably yelled at and stuff by parents who don't agree with that. I don't know. So
it's not our job.
Tricky one.
It's not our job to convince someone to vote for a political party.
It was a great chat, though. It really got me thinking. Like you and Alastair talking about that. I was having this whole debate in my mind.
We are, you know, putting together contracts about him replacing you currently.
I know. I'm sweating.
Yeah. So we can get up to number 1 as well on the podcast charts. I don't know, but you know, in general, it was a really nice chat. I wanted to talk very briefly with you about lowering the voting age, because I did talk to Alastair about it, and you said about how the crossover in school might at least force schools to maybe do an assembly and say, by the way, guys, you can literally vote now. So again, here's how it works. Here's how the voting system works. You know, you can choose not to vote. That's part of this democracy. Blah 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 blah. But the point I was trying to make to him, but like, even though I think it's a good idea, because again, I wish I had it at 16 because I had a voice about going to university. And especially now with the, policies like national service and stuff, it does seem insane that, you can be 16, 17 about to be forced to go to do national service, but without having a single say on whether you actually think that's right or not. I don't know. It seems crazy to me, but I do look at it and I think, okay, is there a danger in doing that people in school might be canvassed in a certain way because there's left-leaning people? And also the fact that, like we said, our children more generally left-wing anyway. So in doing this, right, whether we think there's a justification or not, if the shoe was on the other foot, is that the saying?
Yeah,
I said it the right way around.
You did.
It's funny, I notice it when I get it right. When I get it wrong, I just ignore it. But let's say there was something that was completely justifiable, but it helped the right-wing policy. I know I'd probably be the first person to say, "Oh, well, that's convenient, isn't it?"
Yeah,
even if they had a really good argument. So, lowering the voting age.
Yeah.
Is it a good thing, or is it? Are we doing the same thing where the other way around? We'd be really annoyed, but because us personally are more leaning towards what the children think and the younger people, we just go, "Oh, well, it's fine. We justified it."
I think it's a double-edged blade. Yes, children are generally more left. That's just proven statistically. They are generally more on the left side of politics, but they're also the most impressionable people in our society. So, I think there's two ways of looking at it. It's like, okay, you lower the voting age. All right, Tory parents will be having a feast. The ones that want to, have that impression on their children.
Sure.
But equally,
same for Labour.
The other way around because they're impressionable and they're generally more left. I think it would have a higher yield towards the left. But I actually think it's a bad idea by itself. Yeah. I think it has to come with education.
What do you think about what Alastair said about you can't even assume they're going to be left wing? But
he said you can't assume Labour, didn't he?
Yeah.
He said you can't assume they'll vote Labour, and I think that's I don't know. He can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like that's a slightly different point. I'd love for him to correct me on this, but I do feel like it's undeniable that children are on average more left wing.
Yeah, no, that's been proven again and again. When you do like mock run throughs,
doesn't mean they'll vote Labour.
No, yeah.
Because it depends on the party they think that represents them.
Yeah.
But
as a more right leaning party, you might be a bit like, that's bloody annoying, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel funny about it. I feel like anyone in Labour would be absolutely being like, let's get the voting age down because it probably is going to benefit them.
I'm surprised they haven't done it sooner, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I guess overall then, thinking about, we talked about, the role of us in a classroom. I think, it has to be as much as possible taking your opinion out of it in the same way you have to take your opinion out of your religious, or even your scientific stuff sometimes, depending on what school you're in. If you're in a really religious school and you're teaching evolution, there might be some parents who don't like that. Where is that line? But I guess to finish off, and teachers listening right now, even parents or anyone just thinking about, okay, I'm sending my kid to school. I need to make sure they're getting a fair hearing and they're not indoctrinated and all this kind of stuff. Which I think we did say earlier. Unfortunately, I do think it does happen where there are some teachers who will take it upon themselves to maybe cross that line. And we can decide where that
lots
line
of aspects, not just politics.
Exactly that. In any aspect, exactly.
Yeah.
Would you say, having taught now for 8-9 years, as a child in a school being taught about politics, is it worse than ever for children right now? Is this point in time right now, is the answer they get into politics and they need to be putting their head in the game and learning all about it? Or is it just so bad that, apathy is the only solution? They can't bother. These books are nice, they're a cool idea, but until things change from the top down, what is the point?
No, I'm the first to be cynical sometimes. But I don't think so. I think there's always hope.
Yeah.
I think that there could be some really good changes over the next 4 years. I don't think that, I think everyone in Labour and anyone into politics has said that there's not going to be any quick fixes here.
No.
We are in a state. Our country is in an absolute state, and there's going to be some horrible priorities. But I do see hope. I think the next generation children could grow up and actually have a moment where they're like, oh, politics did a good thing for me. Like you mentioned how there was an enormous period of your life where it was like, I can't point to one single thing that politics have done like that's like a really big benefit to my life. I think that could change. I do. I have hope for it. I don't know if that's the question you asked.
No, you're right. It's basically, Alastair seems very hopeful. He seemed very much like, and he says this a lot when he's talking in this podcast and stuff. He says if we're in politics, we have to be trying to share hope.
Yeah,
we can't, because his podcast host Rory has written a book about his time in politics, and it's essentially
your son.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, but I didn't. Is essentially really scathing of how he said it's an awful place to be. It ruined me mentally. You can't get anything done. There's people who don't know what they're doing, who've just been voted in.
So frustrating.
So there's like a bit of a dichotomy there between the two of them, who've both been in there, and you know, Rory's very much like, it is just, or it's dreadful. Whereas Alastair's like, no, but you know, come on, we can change this, we can do this. So I guess the question is, can we do it? Do you think it's worth our time as teachers putting this groundwork in? Do you 100%. Think it's going to be changed?
100%. I think it's the only thing we can possibly do to change the system is educate kids better. Yeah. That's it. You know, Labour's all been about that forever. Educate kids properly. I still think that's the answer. I just think we don't do it. Yeah. You know, we get governments in place that just strip that back, and then it's like, okay, let's reflect on this for a second. Can we go back to educating kids properly and actually giving them like food and pencils and stuff? Because we stopped doing that for some reason.
So much stems from it, doesn't it? I look at education and health, and I think almost everything stems from those 2 things, right? If you get education right, your next
if we educate the next generation properly, and give them a bit more input on politics, then maybe we won't have a society that's so easily brainwashed, or at least there'll be a huge population where it's just like that swing vote, you know, those where it's just so easy to manipulate people, as we've seen over the last 10 years. Yeah. Maybe if we have a generation that aren't so easy to manipulate, and I feel like that's already happening. I don't know. Let's hope that could be good. Let's hope. You know, it's happening. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Okay. We'll round it off there. I don't know, Hayden, how the listeners are going to cope with me and you not doing our rambling catch up for 10, 15
we'll have
minutes.
To do it next time.
I mean, I don't know how you're going to cope because luckily for us, we were scraping around for things. We're going to talk about the residential next time.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a catch up. I've got a few things I want to talk about, and we'll have a new government by then.
We will. I know we will. That's crazy. And if you hear from Alastair's podcast, perhaps you're just tuning in because you know who's on our podcast.
If you've got this far, my goodness me, wow.
Thank you for listening. And if you want to hear two teachers just talk about stuff, sometimes we're a bit funny. Sometimes we're a bit funny.
Yeah.
Sometimes we talk about really serious stuff, and it's mostly around education. So, you know, tune in.
Yeah, good job we did that right at the very end of the podcast.
We're also really, really, really bad at running a podcast. We forget to plug ourselves all the time. Don't have a sponsor. We do free sponsors sometimes for our mates. And
I'm in an absolutely boring room. And let's just talk about the fact that my video stopped working while I was with Alastair Campbell, the number one podcast
this one's not even on
in the whole UK. It's not even on the video anymore.
I'm staring at the camera
because
right now.
my video overheated because it's been so hot. Because we don't live in a studio or work in a studio.
Guys, check out any other episode other than this one, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.